Sarah stepped into the Grand Southampton estate on the 23rd of March, carrying a worn cloth bag and a contract signed just the day before. She had no idea this sprawling stone mansion harbored a suffocating quiet that seemed mixed right into its foundation. At 32, burdened by rent that was a month overdue, Sarah knew she needed this job more than anything. The staffing agency had been blunt, the estate demanded absolute discretion, flawless punctuality, and zero unnecessary contact with the wealthy owner. When bills tighten their grip, strict rules simply become minor details. The house was enormous, 3 massive floors, 8 bedrooms, and a main hall with ceilings so high a whisper would echo into the void. Sarah arrived long before 7 a.m. At the service entrance, the head housekeeper, Nancy, received her with a stern, unwavering gaze. Holding a printed list of chores, Nancy made it clear there was no room for idle chatter. Sarah was ordered to start on the 3rd floor, work her way down the east wing, and finish the grand hall before noon. An elderly gardener, Mr. Harrison, offered Sarah a brief, sympathetic nod from the doorway as she left. Nancy's final commands were absolute: never open closed doors, never answer ringing phones, and never ask questions. Sarah quietly tucked the list into her apron and set off to work. The 3rd floor felt stagnant, as though it hadn't been lived in for years. As Sarah dragged her damp mop across the polished hardwood, she noticed every door was firmly shut except for the last one on the left. A weak sliver of light spilled from the slightly ajar door, accompanied by heavy silence. Respecting Nancy's warnings, Sarah moved past without a lingering glance. By 10 a.m., she reached the cavernous main hall after scrubbing 2 guest bathrooms and polishing the grand mahogany banister. Her hands were stinging from the harsh chemicals. Her mind anxiously calculated if she'd have enough time to pick up her 8-year-old daughter, Alice, from school before 5 p.m. Kneeling on the freezing marble floor, vigorously rubbing a cloth against the baseboards, she heard it for the first time, a low, trembling whimper drifting from the shadows above the grand staircase. Sarah froze, holding her breath. The fragile crying persisted for 3 slow seconds before dissolving back into the silence. She lifted her head, staring up at the distant ceiling, before forcing herself back to work. It wasn't her problem. At noon, the grandfather clock chimed, and Nancy appeared to inspect the work. Finding it up to her high expectations, she paid Sarah in cash and told her to return on Tuesday. Sarah thanked her and walked out the back door. But on the long walk to the bus stop, the phantom sound of that quiet, desperate crying refused to leave her mind. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah familiarized herself with the house. She learned which floorboards groaned and how a specific heavy window in the east corridor would stubbornly swing open against the ocean breeze. Most importantly, she discovered that the room on the 3rd floor belonged to the owner's young daughter, Brooke. Sarah learned the name by accident, overhearing Nancy sternly explaining on the phone that the child had refused her dinner again and a doctor needed to be summoned. Sarah kept her head down, pretending she hadn't heard a single syllable. From that moment, Sarah paid closer attention. Brooke looked about 5 years old, incredibly pale, with large, sorrowful eyes. On the rare occasions they crossed paths, the child would immediately look away. It wasn't childish shyness, it was the heartbreaking silence of a young soul who had learned that speaking changed nothing. Thomas, the millionaire father, was a towering figure Sarah rarely saw. Always in flawlessly tailored suits, he constantly paced the halls with a phone pressed to his ear, arguing about profit margins and corporate mergers. Whenever he passed Sarah, his eyes remained fixed straight ahead, treating her like invisible wallpaper. Sarah didn't mind. Life had taught her that wealthy men rarely notice the hands that scrub their floors. On a dreary Thursday morning, everything changed. While Sarah was scrubbing the 3rd floor corridor, Brooke's bedroom door creaked open. The tiny girl stood in the threshold, clutching a worn rag doll, her eyes red and puffy. Sarah paused, her soapy sponge hovering midair. Gently, without sudden movements, Sarah softly asked, "Are you all right?" The little girl didn't answer, but she didn't retreat either. She just stared at the kneeling maid with a bewildered expression. Sarah didn't push. She lowered her sponge back into the warm water and resumed scrubbing, letting a comfortable, patient silence stretch between them. A few minutes later, Brooke timidly shuffled forward and sat on the cold floor, leaning against the wallpaper while tightly hugging her doll. No words were exchanged, but a quiet bond was forming in the shadows. By the time Sarah carried her bucket toward the stairs, Brooke had slipped back into her room, leaving a strange warmth in Sarah's chest. The next week, the scenario repeated, but Brooke sat just 2 meters away, watching the soapy circles Sarah drew on the floor. Suddenly, her tiny voice broke the silence. "Do you know how to braid hair?" Sarah looked up at the girl's serious gaze. "I do," Sarah replied gently. "My own daughter has long hair, just like yours." Brooke looked down at her unkempt locks, nervously picking at her expensive dress. She whispered to the floor that Nancy didn't know how to braid, complaining that the housekeeper pulled too tightly, making her head ache. Sarah simply nodded, tucking that information into her heart, knowing that pressing for details would cause the girl to shut down. 3 days later, on a bright Friday morning, Brooke appeared with a colorful elastic band. She silently extended her hand, offering the hair tie with hopeful eyes. Sarah abandoned her cleaning cloth, wiped her hands on her apron, and told the little girl to sit comfortably on the floor. Sarah separated the tangled strands with deliberate slowness. As she skillfully wove the golden hair, she murmured softly, "Beautiful hair requires patience. A good braid should never hurt." Beneath her fingertips, Sarah felt the rigid tension melt from the child's shoulders. When the neat braid was secured, the beginnings of a soft smile flickered across Brooke's normally stoic face. Thomas witnessed the entire exchange from the far end of the hallway. Standing frozen, his phone forgotten in his hand, he watched the tender scene. A sharp ache bloomed fiercely in his chest, a forgotten feeling he hadn't allowed himself to experience in a very long time. When Brooke retreated to her room, Thomas silently walked away, leaving Sarah unaware of his presence. In the days that followed, Thomas unexpectedly began materializing in parts of the estate he usually avoided. He would linger on the second-floor landing while Sarah dusted the foyer below, or review documents in the kitchen while she mopped nearby. Nancy noticed this shift but kept her mouth shut. Sarah, however, was too exhausted by her own survival to notice. Her rent was still dangerously overdue, her daughter Alice had twisted her ankle at school, and the unreliable city bus kept running late. But on a quiet Wednesday, while Sarah was washing dishes, Thomas strolled into the kitchen. Sarah swiftly filled a clean crystal glass with filtered water, placed it on the counter, and returned to the sink. He lingered, tapping his fingers against the glass before softly breaking the silence. "Brooke mentioned your name at dinner last night." Sarah froze, slowly turning off the faucet. What could she have said about the cleaning woman? Thomas looked directly at her. "She said you know how to braid hair without causing any pain." An intense undercurrent filled the room. Both knew this conversation wasn't about hair, but neither was ready to name the deeper truth. "It's simply a matter of paying attention," Sarah replied softly. "And exercising basic care when handling someone else." Thomas nodded slowly, receiving her words like an answer to a much larger question, and quietly exited. Throughout the following week, Brooke appeared on the lower floors much more frequently. Whenever Sarah cleaned the reception areas, Brooke would sit on the bottom step of the staircase, asking simple questions about the blue cleaning solution or the yellow dusting cloth. Sarah answered with the same warmth she used with her own daughter. Through these pressure-free exchanges, Brooke began to open her guarded heart. One afternoon, she confessed that she hated her massive bedroom because it felt too big and grew terribly noisy at night, even when there was no sound at all. On another morning, she bluntly stated that her mother had packed her bags and left 2 years ago, and that her father hated speaking about it. Sarah never pushed. She just listened with undivided attention, stripping any trace of pity from her face. Thomas learned about these conversations because Brooke excitedly repeated fragments of them during their evening meals. He listened without correction, storing each phrase in his heart with fierce protectiveness. On a late Friday afternoon, Thomas descended the stairs to the grand hall where Sarah was organizing her supplies. "You don't need to rush to leave today," he said softly, offering unprecedented permission to finish at a relaxed pace. Sarah turned in surprise. His hands were in his pockets, and his phone was nowhere in sight. The rigidly tense executive was gone. Sarah responded firmly, balancing politeness with her established boundaries. "I always complete my work on time, sir. I don't expect special treatment." A small, genuine smile crossed his handsome features. "I recognize your efficiency, Sarah. I'm just suggesting you don't need to exhaust yourself on my account." He quietly turned and exited, leaving Sarah alone with a yellow cloth clutched in her hand. Her mind warned her that when a wealthy man pays attention to the cleaning staff, he usually wants something. But later on the crowded city bus, staring at the blurry streetlights, she found herself recalling his smile far more times than she allowed herself to admit. The next week, a milestone occurred. Brooke finally laughed out loud, a beautiful sound triggered by a soapy sponge loudly slapping against the wet marble floor. Sarah made no fuss, refusing to scare the fragile joy away, but continued scrubbing with a lighter heart. Thomas had witnessed the miracle too, standing in the shadows by the fireplace. As Brooke's face returned to its usual seriousness, Thomas locked eyes with Sarah across the vast room, his expression radiating absolute gratitude. That look unsettled Sarah, causing her to quickly lower her eyes and retreat into the dining room. It was the raw emotion of a desperate parent who had finally witnessed a sliver of light in a long, dark tunnel. She needed to process the emotions churning in her chest. She knew this was no longer just professional sympathy. 2 days later, Thomas appeared in the kitchen early in the morning, before Nancy arrived. As Sarah was organizing her caddy, he gently slid a steaming cup of rich coffee across the marble island. "Do you drink coffee?" he asked, completely ignoring traditional boundaries. Sarah stared at the expensive cup, then up at his waiting face. "I do." "Take this one," he said smoothly. "I brewed far too much for myself." It was an obvious fabrication, but Sarah accepted the warm cup to avoid an awkward scene. For 4 minutes, they existed in a remarkably comfortable silence, listening to the heavy coastal rain lashing against the windows. "How many years have you been cleaning houses?" Thomas softly broke the quiet. "Roughly 8 years," Sarah replied, explaining that she had spent almost all of them in private residences. She mentioned a short, unpleasant stint at a commercial cleaning company, admitting she hated scrubbing empty corporate buildings. "Why do you prefer houses?" Thomas asked. Sarah swallowed the last drop of coffee. "In a corporate office, you simply scrub an empty space. But in a family home, you carefully clean a living history." Thomas stared thoughtfully into his mug before quietly agreeing. Sarah rinsed her cup in the brass sink, offered a polite thank you, and reached for her rubber gloves. She needed to maintain the line between owner and help, but she acutely realized that the invisible boundary was growing thinner every morning. In the final week of March, an extraordinary sound echoed through the estate. Brooke was running wildly down the polished corridor. Hearing the rapid slapping of tiny feet, Sarah spun around just in time to catch the little girl, who threw her arms wide open with a brilliant laugh bursting from her chest. The heavy years of sorrow vanished, leaving only a carefree child. Sarah dropped to her knees, catching Brooke against her chest, her own eyes growing hot with unshed tears. Thomas froze near the entrance, paralyzed by the sight of his daughter radiating genuine happiness for the first time in 2 agonizing years. Brooke spun around, spotted her stunned father, and excitedly asked, "Can Sarah teach me how to bake a cake today?" Thomas immediately shifted his gaze to Sarah, his eyes silently pleading for cooperation, completely discarding any formal house rules. "If Sarah is willing to tackle the mess, I am entirely on board." Sarah looked at the hopeful child and the desperate father, threw her rigid rules out the window, and warmly agreed. For the next 2 hours, the pristine kitchen experienced a chaotic, joyful noise it had never known. Brooke plunged her hands into the sticky batter, wildly tossing white flour across the black marble counters. Sarah happily allowed the mess, knowing a child baking for the first time needs the freedom to make mistakes. Thomas hovered awkwardly for 10 minutes before tying a floral apron around his waist, completely ignoring his expensive dress shirt. When Brooke looked up and saw her serious corporate father covered in flour, she released a booming, uncontrollable belly laugh. Thomas immediately joined in with a deep laugh of his own. For one beautiful hour, the cold kitchen transformed into the warm heart of a real home. The resulting chocolate cake was delightfully lopsided and slightly burnt, but absolutely the most delicious thing Brooke had eaten in 2 years. She made the pronouncement with a mouth full of frosting, and her father solemnly agreed. When the grandfather clock chimed 8 p.m., signaling it was far past her departure time, Sarah removed her stained apron and gathered her worn bag. Brooke was already fast asleep on the velvet sofa, a streak of white flour still clinging to her golden hair. Thomas accompanied Sarah to the grand foyer. The heavy silence had returned, but this time it felt soft and protective. Standing by the massive front door, he quietly thanked her, not just for the house, but for bringing the light back into his daughter's eyes. Before Sarah could offer a professional response, Thomas gently handed her an envelope. He softly explained that it contained her wages, a permanent advancement to clear her overdue rent, and the contact information for the best pediatric specialist in the city for her daughter Alice's ankle. Sarah stared at the envelope, her throat tight. She looked up at Thomas, seeing past the wealthy exterior straight into the soul of a man who was finally learning how to heal. For the first time, she didn't push the boundary away. She offered him a genuine smile of her own, whispering a quiet thank you that broke the last lingering wall between them. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, the ocean breeze no longer felt harsh, it felt like a fresh beginning. Sometimes, a little bit of kindness is all it takes to change someone's entire world. If Sarah and Brooke's journey touched your heart today, please give this video a like and share it with someone who needs a reminder that hope is always around the corner. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next emotional story. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.